It's a delight to be. We're now in our 23rd year and we've been bringing this program to you for that long, which is amazing. Um, but anyway, this of course started before I was born, but aside from that, it has been a very long and a wonderful program. I think as we were talking just before coming on air, that while we were able to plan our programs sort of in the future, what we're finding in this past period that news and events are happening so quickly that it's very hard to keep up with everything. Every day we wake up and there is something else that we need to respond to. So we've been very lucky that we've had excellent speakers. And I think at any time, more than ever, it is really appreciated to have people who understand the field to help us understand what's going on when the news is changing so quickly. So I'm joined by Tyler Beebe, um, Amy Friedman, who is not with us today. She has a group of students out in Mexico, Naomi Marrow and Carolyn Resnick. So this is a team that works very hard to bring you great people to help us with this analysis. Today, we're going to turn to the Middle East, and we have someone who is getting to be very well known to us and who we love having. He is he was with us about a year ago, um, just a few months after the Israeli-Gaza war broke out. And he was going to talk, he was then talking about what were the possible ramifications of what was going on. So here we are now, about a year after that. Of course, things have been very quiet in the Middle East, and I don't know what Ken is going to be able to talk about. Um, Maybe there are a few things that have changed. We certainly have a new US president. So, Ken will probably have a few things to say about that. But before we begin our program, our speaker will be with us for about 35 minutes speaking. And then we will continue with questions first from our panelists and then from you on the chat. We will have a hard stop at 11:15. Um, I know that Ken is going to provoke a lot of questions from you. So please do use the chat, ask your questions. We will try to get to all the questions. We may run out of time, but we will certainly make attempt to get to your questions. As you know, our program is being recorded and we archive for on-demand viewing at the Chappaqua website, which will be under Events and Foreign Policy. And now it is my pleasure to ask Tyler Beebe to introduce our guest.
Great. Well, thanks, June. And as we all know only too well, there seems to be no end to the conflict and chaos in the Middle East, which it's been experiencing, especially following Hamas's invasion of Israel back in October of 2023. Whether it's Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, or Israel, the region's dynamics have changed, in some cases dramatically, over the last year and a half. So, who better to put the chaos and confusion in perspective and to assess how recent events will have an impact on U.S. foreign policy than Ken Pollack, who is our speaker today? Ken joins us for what I think may be the fourth time, and we are immensely appreciative to Ken for the time he has spent over the years edifying us on the Middle East. Ken recently joined the Middle East Institute in Washington as Vice President for Policy. He's also a senior advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Previously, Ken has been a senior fellow at three very notable think tanks, including the Brookings Institution, the Council on Foreign Relations, and the American Enterprise Institute. And before that, Ken was a Middle East analyst for the CIA and served on the National Security Council in the Clinton administration. So, Ken, thanks again so much for joining us. And please give us your take on the Middle East, recent events, and how they may influence U.S. foreign policy in that region. So take it away, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Tyler, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, June. Thank all of you. I always enjoy being with the Chappaqua Library Foreign Policy Group. Always an enjoyable morning session for me, too. So, as June was pointing out, there's really nothing going on in the Middle East. I really don't know why all of you folks wanted to hear from me because it's really been so quiet there. But I'll try very hard to dig deep and see if I can come up with some things to talk about. So why don't we start with Israel? Why don't we start with Israel and the Palestinians and the breakdown of the ceasefire in Gaza? Um, the first point to make is that it's not entirely clear. I don't think any of us has a very clear sense of exactly what happened. I think you're all aware that the first stage of the ceasefire had been completed. The Israelis released 1,500 Palestinian prisoners, and in return, Hamas did eventually release 30 Israeli hostages. This was supposed to have been followed by a second stage of the ceasefire in which Israel was supposed to pull out of Gaza altogether, and Hamas was supposed to release all of the remaining hostages. That second phase has not been completed. It broke down. The Israelis preempted it by resuming military operations. And of course, as I think you're all aware, and you can just assume because it's the Middle East, both sides have conflicting narratives as to exactly what was going on there. In particular, it does seem to be the case that a major impetus for Israel was that it was clear that Hamas was reemerging as the main political and military power in Gaza, and that was unacceptable to the Netanyahu government. And the decision was made to go ahead and restart military operations so as not to reward them. That said, the Israelis have also said that in the negotiations over what that second phase would actually look like, the broad outlines have been agreed to, but the details had not. And of course, the devil is always in the details. What they said was that Hamas was hemming and hawing and not really showing any willingness to give back all of the remaining hostages, including the dead bodies. The big piece that nobody really knows about, but everyone speculates on, of course, is Prime Minister Netanyahu's motives, as well as what he may be being told by President Trump. Again, I think you're all aware of the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu has a fairly narrow, very right-wing cabinet. And when he signed the ceasefire agreement, when he agreed to the ceasefire under a tremendous amount of pressure from both the Biden and incoming Trump administrations, he lost key members of his coalition, far right-wing members who were absolutely uninterested in any ceasefire with Hamas, who were much more interested in continuing the military operations against Hamas than they were in getting the hostages back. And that's not to suggest that they didn't want the hostages back. It's just that Israel, of course, has this terrible trade-off to make. Ceasefire to try to get the hostages back, or no ceasefire to try to further damage, further destroy Hamas. And so as a result, when Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed to the ceasefire, he lost those key members of his coalition. And by resuming military operations, he's got them back. And that's obviously very important to him in terms of his own domestic politics. He's got to pass a budget. If he can't do so, that will bring about the fall of his government. And he's got to do that in basically about a week. So resuming the military operations, may have actually been more about restoring his domestic political coalition so that he could get a budget passed so that his government wouldn't fall. And that's certainly been the charge levied by any number of his domestic critics, that this is ultimately about his domestic political fortunes, not what is in the best interests of the state of Israel or its people. And so at this moment, there's a lot of uncertainty as to exactly what's going on. And as I've already mentioned, another big piece of this is the new Trump administration. In the past, President Trump has had a pretty good relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It does seem like they're on pretty good terms now. I'm being cautious about that because As some of you are probably aware, when after the 2020 elections here in the US, Prime Minister Netanyahu picked up the phone and congratulated Joe Biden on winning the election, as any foreign leader is expected to do. And President Trump went absolutely ballistic, felt that this was a betrayal by Netanyahu, of course, believed that he had won, insisted that he had won, and was furious that Prime Minister Netanyahu would go ahead and call President Biden and congratulate him on his win. So the relationship is not perfect, right? There is bad blood there. It's unclear how much they've repaired that relationship, but there does seem to have been, some rapprochement between them. And for that reason, we don't quite know what the conversations have been between the two of them. Prime Minister Netanyahu was here in the White House. They clearly discussed it. And I think to a certain extent, Prime Minister Netanyahu also feels like President Trump is, how do I put this, is creating space for him to do some things in Israel that he has always wanted to do, similar to things that President Trump is doing over here. So again, you're probably all aware in the newspapers now that the Israeli cabinet, at Prime Minister Netanyahu's direction, voted to remove the chief of Israel's Shin Bet, its internal security service, something that has provoked massive protests in Israel, but very much in keeping with the same kinds of executive authorities that President Trump has been trying to implement here in the United States. So again, there clearly is a relationship. They're clearly speaking, and we never quite know what President Trump is telling Prime Minister Netanyahu, to what extent he's encouraging him to take these actions, or simply saying to him, I've got your back. Whatever you want to do it because I've got your back. And so these domestic political considerations and the relationship with the United States also seem to be part of the mix. Where it's headed, as usual, it's the Middle East. It's anyone's guess. For the moment, it doesn't seem like Israel has any interest in, once again, agreeing to ceasefire terms. And again, it's very hard to not assume that at least some element of that is about Prime Minister Netanyahu's domestic political considerations, that he's got to get this budget through, and that as long as he's got the budget hanging out there, he's likely to continue the war, if only to keep his domestic political coalition together. Perhaps after that budget gets passed, assuming it gets passed, perhaps then they'll be willing to go back to the bargaining table. But by the same token, they do also have some real considerations beyond the political ones. Hamas has got to be willing to surrender all of the remaining hostages. And I think that it's going to be very hard for Israel to accept a new permanent ceasefire if it leaves Hamas in control of the Gaza Strip. So I think there's still a lot of uncertainty there. And I certainly wouldn't be surprised if Israeli military operations roll on for some time to come, largely because no one has come up with a really good day after that will allow Israel to enjoy some degree of peace, that will remove Hamas as the military and political authorities in Gaza, and hopefully also give the Palestinians of Gaza a better set of circumstances, maybe even a brighter future. And so right now, Israel's won a huge military victory over Hamas, but the political verdict, which is always the ultimate verdict in any war, is very much uncertain. I'm glad to talk about that more in the Q&A when we get to that. Let me move a little bit. Let me shift gears and talk about another one of the Middle East countries that's very much in play these days, and that's Syria. Right. With Syria, again, as I think you're all aware, the Assad regime fell and fell very quickly at the end of 2024, unseated by a coalition of opposition groups led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, we call HTS, now led by a man by the name of Ahmed al-Shara. Shara and HTS were ultimately backed by the Turks, and the Turks clearly have a very significant amount of influence with HTS, but they're not in full control over the situation. In addition, as again, I think all of you are aware, HTS is not in full control of Syria. First, in the far east of Syria, most of that territory, a huge chunk of Syria, almost a third of the country, is controlled by the group that we refer to as the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which are dominated by Syria's Kurds and backed by American military personnel. The Kurds, of course, have a very difficult relationship with the Syrian regime. They always have, as they always have with every government in the Middle East, since they were forced to be part of these different countries after the First World War. They've never really wanted to be part of these countries. They have constantly rebelled against them. After ISIS attacked Iraq and took over huge swaths of Syria, the United States intervened, backed them, enabled them to gain control over all of this territory that they really don't want to give back to the Syrian government, at least unless they get real guarantees that they're going to be able to preserve their own military forces to defend their people and are allowed some degree of control, some degree of autonomy over their political, economic, and cultural circumstances, right? All of which is very problematic for the new HTS regime in Baghdad, which wants to be sovereign, which wants to have control of all Syrian territory, and wants to see all of Syria's peoples, including the Kurds, integrated into Syria, wants to have control of all of Syria's territory. In addition, ISIS is still out there. There are other nasty terrorist groups, Islamist terrorist groups out there as well that control territory, that mount attacks. And then last, as I think you all saw in the newspapers in the last few weeks, the population in the far west of Syria along the coastline, which is largely minorities, Alawis, Christians, Circassians, a whole variety of others. These were the core constituents of the Assad regime. Assad and his family were themselves Alawis. These were their power base. These were the people that they really trusted and relied on to run the regime. But as you can imagine, in part for that reason, created all kinds of frictions, all kinds of tensions with Syria's majority Sunni Muslim population. And Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, they are Sunni Muslim Islamists. I want to be careful about using the word extremist because I want to come back and talk about that a little bit. But the Alawis, even though Assad has left the country, the Alawis and some of the other minorities have been resisting HTS's assertion of control over all of their territory. There have been a number of Alawi fighters who've attacked government forces, and it led to a number of very serious street battles in previous weeks. So you've got a regime in Damascus, it's brand new, doesn't have full control over its east, where there's an American-backed group, doesn't have full control over the West, where the minorities that were the real power base of Assad's regime continue to have a considerable amount of military presence, trying to protect their civilian population and pushing back on this regime. And then, of course, the last piece of it are the Israelis, who have used the chaos in Syria to take control over a significant amount of territory in southwest Syria, bordering on the Golan Heights, carving out what is in effect a buffer zone down there, something that is understandable given what happened to Israel after October 7th. The Israeli response to that has been, it's clear that our enemies don't respect the borders, so why should we? And we're going to try to take as much territory as we can and push our enemies back from our borders as far as we reasonably can. But we should note, this is creating tremendous anger and resentment among Syrians, including HTS, which has otherwise signaled a real willingness to kind of, let bygones be bygones with Israel and find a way to live with them. They haven't yet said that they would sign a peace treaty, but they're certainly making all kinds of noises indicating that they could be willing to do so. And so Israel's unilateral moves to take this territory has been creating all kinds of friction and putting in jeopardy what the long-term relationship between Israel and this new regime in Syria could be. Now, the last thing I wanted to say about Syria is what in some ways is the most important one. As I said, HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham, they are Sunni Muslims, and I almost use the word extremists because they started out, it's very important to understand that they started out as offshoots of Al-Qaeda and of ISIS itself. In fact, Ahmed Ashara, the leader of HTS, was a Syrian fighter who had gone to Iraq to fight against the American occupation of Iraq and to fight against the Shia of Iraq, who the United States was empowering because, of course, we built a democracy in Iraq. The Shia were the majority in Iraq, and therefore the Shia took power. And you had all of these jihadi groups that went to Iraq to fight us, to fight the Shia. Ahmed Ashara was one of those people. And he was the guy who the leader of IS, then the Islamic State in Iraq, sent back to Syria when they were on their last legs in Iraq, but the civil war broke out in Syria. Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq, the leader of ISIS in Iraq, said to Ahmed Ashara, one of his lieutenants, "You're a Syrian, go back to Syria, set up a presence in Syria, establish a beachhead for us in Syria, and let's rebuild our movement, which was effectively destroyed in Iraq by the US surge there. Let's rebuild in Syria." So Ashara goes off to Syria and starts to rebuild their strength in Syria, turns it into a massive organization, combat organization, becomes one of the primary opposition groups, breaks with ISIS, breaks from Baghdadi, breaks from Al-Qaeda as well, and tries to forge a more moderate path for this group. They are Muslims, they are Sunni fundamentalists, they are Islamists, but they've tried hard to distance themselves from the more extreme elements of ISIS's ideology, of Al-Qaeda's ideology. And since he's come to power, Shara has been at great pains to try to portray himself and his new government as being a moderate one. As I said, he's made all kinds of noises about wanting to live in peace with Israel. He's made all kinds of noises about wanting to live at peace with the Kurds and being willing to respect Kurdish rights. If you are aware, the Kurdish groups did sign a peace agreement, ceasefire agreement with the government. It's very vague, but it talked about terms under which the Kurds might actually integrate into the Syrian regime and into the Syrian military forces. And I will also say, Tyler described the fact that I'm now the vice president in a new think tank, or it's an old think tank, but it's new for me, the Middle East Institute. And two of my Syria experts were recently in Syria. And they met with Shara himself as well as his entire government. And they came away absolutely convinced that Shara is the real deal, that he really has learned that moderation is the right answer for Syria, that he's absolutely committed to it, and that he's very much in charge in Damascus. Now, they also did come back and say, while Shara is very much in charge and they believe he absolutely is real about moderating his views, wanting to have better relations with the US, with Israel, with the Kurds, with all of these different groups that we care about, that his military leaders remain very extreme, and that they also seem to oppose many of his more moderate policies. And so what they came back and said is, look, we're not worried about Ashara, which many people still are. They regard him as a wolf in sheep's clothing. They don't know whether they can trust him. So, my two experts came back, and these are very, very seasoned hands on Syria. They said, look, we think he's the real deal. But what they also said was, we don't trust many of his military commanders, and we're afraid that at some point his military commanders will try to overthrow him. Now, they also said, look, this is an incredibly charismatic guy. The Syrian people absolutely love him. And if the West is willing to lift sanctions on Syria, that will probably provide an enormous economic boost for Syria, which will very much redound to his benefit, help him solidify his control over Syria. And if that's the case, it's going to be very, very hard for anyone to remove him. But if not, if the Syrian economy continues to absolutely founder and it's in miserable shape after, at this point in time, 13 years of civil war and all kinds of damage by the Assad regime, by the Russians, right? It desperately needs massive infusions of external aid and investment and trade. And if the sanctions aren't lifted, then those circumstances could make it very hard for Shara to retain power. And if that's the case, we may get a much more radical Syrian regime. And one of the other things that they pointed out, and I think it's important that we all think about it, is that, again, the resentment, the anger that Israel is breeding with Syria seems to be turning people who'd like to be, if not friends, at the very least neutral toward Israel, potentially turning them into enemies of Israel. On that somewhat somber note, but again, it's the Middle East. If I told you all good news, you'd turn off the Zoom feed because you'd know I was lying to you. But I wanted to turn to one last country out there before opening it up to your questions, and that's Iran. And we've talked about this beforehand, but it's worth making these points. Iran suffered a terrific beating over the last year. For the first 6 months, everything was going, first 6 months after October 7th, that is, everything was going Iran's way, right? It looked fantastic for them. The Israelis were bogged down in Gaza. The world was angry at the numbers of civilian casualties their operations were causing. Hezbollah was rocketing Israel. The Houthis had closed down the Bab al-Mandeb, forcing global trade to be redirected around Africa. And they were also firing missiles into Israel. The Shia militias in Iraq, which are also under Iranian guidance, if not control, were also firing rockets into Israel. It looked like everything was going Iran's way. And then everything turned around on them. I'm not going to recount all the history, but the Israeli military operation ultimately did enormous damage to Hamas. Israel then turned on Hezbollah and unleashed the beepers from hell, did tremendous damage to Hezbollah's military leadership, in part because of that, and then turned around and did tremendous damage to Hezbollah's military forces and their rocket arsenal, and as a result left Hezbollah crippled. In 2 operations, Israel then did enormous damage to Iran and then enormous damage to the Houthis as well. And so all of the gains that it looked like Iran was making, all of the wonderful triumphs of its allies, all turned to dust. Right, and ended in a situation where Iran's own deterrence, and remember, Iran had 2 great deterrents. One was its own missile forces, and the other were the rocket and missile forces of Hezbollah. Both of those were stripped away by the Israelis. The Israelis demonstrated that they could prevent Iran from using its missiles to do damage to Israel, and Israel then stripped away all of Iran's most important air defenses, leaving its nuclear sites bare. Israel also took the opportunity to destroy several key missile-related facilities to make it very hard for Iran to rebuild its missile fleet. And of course, it devastated Hezbollah's rocket and missile arsenal, such that Iran really has very little capacity to retaliate against Israel at this point in time. And if the Israelis were to mount further strikes on Iran, including further strikes on Iran's nuclear program, it would be very, very difficult for Iran to respond in any kind of a meaningful way. Now, there are other reasons why Israel has refrained from attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. We can talk about those. They're very important reasons. But nonetheless, the point that I simply wanted to make, and again, that I think all of you are aware of, is that the Iranians are in a very, very weak position right now, and especially compared to the incredibly strong position that they felt that they were in a year ago. That has caused the Iranians to have to completely reassess their regional strategy. What they are mostly doing is kind of going back to basics, going back to try to rebuild their allies all across the region, even having to make some painful concessions there. Not clear what Hezbollah is going to wind up having to concede in Lebanon, but that's a very big question mark for the Iranians. And even the ceasefire that Hezbollah agreed to with Israel was one that Hezbollah really didn't want to accept because it required them to disarm. We'll see if they actually do it, but it required them to do so. But what Iran said to them was, look, you guys, you got to do this because we can't afford to have Israel continuing to hammer on us. We could lose everything. So agree to whatever you need to agree to get the Israelis to turn off their military, and we'll figure out how to rebuild later. That's where the Iranians are. And the last piece of this puzzle that needs to be put on the table, of course, is to bring the Trump administration back in. Glad to talk about whether we're going to have Gaza a largo in the questions. Short answer is no, but there's more to be talked about there. We can talk about any number of other things that the administration is trying to do, but the piece that we really do need to talk about is the Iran piece of this. As you know, President Trump tried for his entire first term in office to get a new nuclear deal with Iran, one that, as he put it, was better than what Obama got. Not clear to me that the president really understood what Obama got, but he was determined to get something better, whatever that meant. He seems determined to try again. And that's important because, as many of you probably are aware, there's good evidence that the Iranians tried to kill President Trump on the campaign trail. And I was wondering whether when President Trump got back to office, he was going to act punitively against Iran, just try to hammer them for trying to kill him. That doesn't seem to be the case. He does seem to want a deal with Iran. But once again, the terms are entirely unclear. It's not at all clear whether President Trump knows in his own mind what he wants to get from the Iranians. It's a deal that makes both our Israeli allies and our Arab allies very, very nervous. They're concerned that President Trump not kind of give everything away to the Iranians. And it's because they don't know what kind of a deal he's offering them or what kind of a deal he'd be willing to make. They don't really know what's in it for them. In addition, Trump has a very big problem with the Iranians, which is having reneged on the original nuclear deal, having pulled the U.S. out unilaterally. The Iranians just don't trust him. And what we've consistently heard from Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is that he doesn't trust Trump and that he doesn't think it's a good idea to make a deal with him. Now, the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, and it's important to understand, the Iranian president is not the leader of Iran, but he's not irrelevant either. He has some power. He's been out there very consistently saying, I want to deal with the Americans. And I think that it is likely that we are going to have negotiations of some kind between Iran and the Trump administration, if only because there are any number of Iranians who are afraid that if they refuse to talk, if they refuse to negotiate, Trump will attack them, impose new sanctions on them, or allow the Israelis to attack them. And they don't want any of those things. So I think that we probably will have negotiations. But as I said, it's going to be very hard for Iran to actually strike a new deal with Trump unless Trump gives them a much better deal than what Obama got. And he might, he does have a habit of just saying this is better or this doesn't exist or, just defining reality however he wants to. So he could just say, I got a better deal, even though everybody else might look at it and say, no, you got a worse deal. So this is possible. But assuming that he's not going to do that, what we may get is a lot of talking but not actual making of concessions, striking a bargain. And if that's the case, at some point, I think that the Trump administration is going to get impatient with the Iranians and do something. And I'm not quite sure what it is. My guess is it will be more sanctions. It's worth understanding. The administration is claiming that they're imposing maximum sanctions on Iran, but the truth is that the additional pressure they've imposed on Iran is actually quite modest. There's a lot more that they could do on the sanctions. And I think that they are purposely holding back. Again, they talk a lot. President Trump loves to make all kinds of wild claims that have no basis in reality. So he's saying he's doing maximum pressure, but I think he's deliberately holding back a number of things that he could do in expectation that when the Iranians do balk, when they do sandbag him, that he can then employ those. That's certainly my most likely scenario, but we just don't know. And part of the issue with Iran is that the Iran negotiations are also wrapped up in our negotiations with China, because China's buying all of Iran's illegally smuggled oil. And they're also all wrapped up in the relationship with Russia. And that's where President Trump's own very close and I find inexplicable relationship with Vladimir Putin comes in, because, of course, Putin has become Iran's most important ally. And I have no doubt that Putin is trying very hard and probably telling the Iranians, don't worry about Trump, I'll take care of Trump. And so it's a very complicated set of negotiations between the United States and Iran, which is also going to bring in the Chinese and the Russians. And where it ends up, I simply could not tell you at this moment in time. So let me stop there, and I'll be glad to answer whatever questions you may have as best I can.
Yeah, and that was really one of the most efficiently delivered, compact summaries of what's going on. Thank you very much. If you had to put all that into a novel about the Middle East, the editor would say, "There's no way it could all be so complicated. Come on now." Oh boy.
Yeah.
Well, look, I'm sure we've all got a lot of questions. I've got a ton. Let me, I guess, start a little bit, backing up just a bit with Syria. I am mystified why the West, particularly the US, has been so reluctant to lift the sanctions on al-Shara. In other words, as you pointed out, the economy, and there was an article in the Economist recently about how terrible the economy is. 90% of Syrians live below the poverty level, blah, 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 blah. So you would think that the pressure on the West to try to bail out Syria and enable it to kind of get on its own 2 feet would encourage them to lift the sanctions, but they're still there. So could you explain that? And then on the periphery, and here we get complicated, talk about the Russian bases in Tartus and Latakia. In other words, I gather they're still there, and the Syrians or al-Shara is talking with the Russians about maybe letting them continue to have equipment and military stuff in those bases. And what does that imply? So that's a two-part question. Yeah.
Yeah, these are great ones, Tyler. Let me start with the U.S. sanctions and say, first, the U.S. has lifted some sanctions on Syria, not the critical economic ones, but we have made a number of other moves. And what the Trump, my conversations with folks in the Trump administration, what they say is, look, we're trying to signal to Shara that we're glad to have conversations with him. We'd like to have a better relationship with him. And we really hope that he does turn out to be as good as his statements are suggesting that he is. But we're not sure. And we want to give him an incentive to keep doing the right thing, right? And I think part of this is how anyone would handle leverage. Part of this is about President Trump's own particular perspectives on how you create and use leverage. He seems to be trying to kind of say to this is the carrot that he's dangling out there for Shara, saying, if you'll keep doing all these good things, we will keep lifting the sanctions. The problem with this approach, right? And again, it's the kind of approach that, yeah, it makes perfect sense if what you're doing is negotiating over, real estate ventures or leases or this kind of stuff. The problem is in the world of politics and diplomacy, that can often backfire on you. Shara has his own constituency. He's got to deliver to the Syrian people. As I said, he's got these military commanders who don't like what he's doing at all. And so he's got to be delivering to them. And if he can't deliver to them, they're going to remove him from office. And so this is my great concern. It's why I my Syria experts here, and I think most of the Syria experts in DC and London, in the Middle East, elsewhere, are all urging the administration to go ahead and lift the sanctions because, again, the game is less about Shara's relationship to us or Shara's relationship to Israel. The real game right now is about Shara's relationship with the Syrian people and with his own military commanders. And if we can't help him win that, nothing else matters, right? But as I said, what the administration is looking at is they're looking at the relationship between him and us and him and Israel. And as I said, my concern is that we're going to lose him altogether if we make that our priority, right? We've got to make sure that he can withstand his own internal challenges, that he can gain control over Syria, beat back those challenges, and then we can use all kinds of other forms of leverage to make sure that we get what we want from him with regard to the Kurds, with regard to Israel, with regard to all of these other issues. Right? But this is the complicated game that we're playing. And as I said, I understand where Trump is coming from on this. I understand why he's doing what he's doing. Personally, I just feel like he's making a mistake because he's putting the cart before the horse.
Mm.
On the Russian bases, yeah, you're absolutely right, Tyler. They are continuing to negotiate with the Russians over this. And what I hear again from my Syria experts who've met with him, met with other Syrian leadership figures, what they're saying is, first, Russia's a powerful country, and it has demonstrated an ability to project power into Syria. They don't want to piss off the Russians, right? They see no reason. In fact, what Shah really wants is he'd like to have good relations with pretty much everybody. He'd like to have good relations with everybody, all of his neighbors. He'd like to have good relations with us, with the Chinese, with the Russians. The country out there that he is most wary of is Iran. Right? And again, that's something else that endears him to me. But he doesn't necessarily want to, as I tick off the Russians. In addition, because he is so concerned about the Iranians, and he does recognize that Putin is Iran's most important ally right now, he seems to also be trying to figure out, can I use the Russians to further get the Iranians off my back? Right? He's convinced that the Iranians are supporting the Alawis, as they have been supporting the Alawis since the start of the Syrian civil war. He's afraid that they're supporting other Syrian minority groups. So right now, his biggest problem is Iran, right? And that's the problem that he's trying to deal with. And he's been looking at Russia as, can I use the Russians? Can I, show them a little leg as a way to get the Russians to help me with my Iran problem? And then I'll deal with my Russia problem. And again, they've suggested at the very least that they would be willing to have a very limited Russian presence of some kind in Syria, which, at one level, look, I don't really like it because I don't like Vladimir Putin being anywhere, including in Russia.
Right.
But, at another level, you can look at it and say, well, it's going to be a far cry from what the Russians had either during the Cold War or during the Syrian civil war. So that's, a lot of progress, and maybe it's worth it to ensure that Iran, and we should remember, Iran was the dominant foreign power in Syria since 2012, right? They were the ones really, running the show. We focused a lot on the Russians for obvious reasons of our own history, but the truth is, on the ground, it was the Iranians who were calling the shots. So they're the hostile power that we really need to make sure is out of Syria altogether. But again, really complicated.
Yeah. Well, fascinating. Thank you. I'm sure we've got some questions from the panel. So,
Tyler?
yeah, go ahead.
Ken, what about Turkey and Syria? Erdogan.
Great question, Naomi. I was hoping somebody was going to ask about that.
I'm here for you.
I also have a world-class Turkey expert here at MBI, and she's just been absolutely fantastic, predicting pretty much every single thing that was going to happen all along. And what I gather from her, I am not a Turkey expert. I sometimes play one on Zoom, but what I take away from her, because she is the real expert here, is point number one. Erdogan is obviously very, very pleased with how things have developed in Syria, right? His ally is now the top dog. They're in control in Damascus. This is fantastic for Erdogan. Point two, for that reason, he's now looking to translate what's happened in Syria into gains for himself domestically in Turkey. Right. And again, I think you're all aware, reading the newspapers, there's a lot going on domestically in Turkey. Erdogan is trying to secure at least another 4 years in power for himself. The Kurds have always been a major issue for him. Again, a lot of history there, but just very, very briefly, when he first came into office, he pursued a peace process with his own Kurdish population. And it was very important to him early on in allowing him to get elected and reelected and getting a lot of his program through. This is a very big element for him and also endeared him to us and to other populations around the world. He then turned against the Kurds and for most of the last 8-10 years has had a very adversarial relationship with his own Kurdish population. That has spilled over into Syria. And of course, this always works back and forth, where he's also been very unhappy with the gains that the Kurds of Syria have made, under our tutelage, under our guidance. And it's been a tremendous source of friction between Erdogan and the United States. You may remember during President Trump's first term, Erdogan is another one of these autocratic leaders that President Trump seemed to be incredibly enamored of. And so during his first term, he made a lot of concessions, did a lot of things that Erdogan was happy about, threatened to pull our troops out several times, which is exactly what Erdogan wanted. He's now back in office and again seems to be very confident. Erdogan seems to be very confident that once again he's going to have a good relationship with Mr. Trump, and that's going to benefit him in Syria with the Kurds, right? But ultimately, as good as things are for Erdogan, there are a bunch of dark linings to these silver clouds, right? So point number one is he has a very good relationship with HTS, with Ahmed Ashara, with the new Syrian government, but they're not in full control over Syria. And, there's a history in recent international relations of, client groups turning on their patron state. Didn't mean to say patron saint. So, at least some of you probably are old enough to remember what happened after Vietnam, after the North won in 1975. And if you remember, China was their most important ally, helped them to win in 1975. And of course, by 1979, they were at war with China invading northern Vietnam. Right? This is a very common pattern. We, of course, helped the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, right? Helped them get the Soviets out, helped bring them to power. Not too far afterwards, we had huge problems with them. The Taliban wasn't exactly the group that we were supporting, but all kinds of groups we were supporting got in bed with the Taliban, right? So just because you support a country doesn't mean that that country remains your ally forever. And there are already some sources of tension between HTS and the Turks. In addition, as I said, we're not yet out of eastern Syria. Erdogan wants us out. The Russians, as Tyler pointed out, aren't fully out of western Syria. Erdogan wants the Russians out. And at the end of the day, he needs to get a peace deal with between the Kurds and Damascus, so that he can then turn around to his own Kurdish population and say, see what I did for you in Syria, for your fellow Kurds in Syria, something that you wanted too. Now I want you to reward me by supporting me to stay in power in Ankara. Right. So very, very complex set of circumstances for Turkey in Syria. I hope what you're taking away from that is things went great. They've gone terrific for Erdogan over the last 6 months, right? He's got his buddy Donald Trump in power in the US. His allies have won big in Damascus. The Iranians have been pushed out. Things look quite good, but nothing's ever perfect in the Middle East. And he's still trying to translate the gains that he made in the short term in Syria into both long-term gains in Syria, lock them in place so that they endure, and translate them into domestic political gains for himself in Turkey.
And 2 points that may be related. The IDF is having increasing difficulty getting their reservists to show up for duty. It's a small country. Okay. And Gaza, sooner or later, has to be rebuilt in some form. Does this press Israel further to accommodate the need for peace? How are all those related? What's going to happen?
Yeah, and I got to tell everyone, I did not pay Naomi to ask these questions, but she's asking all the questions that I was hoping that someone would ask, because I think that these are two huge interrelated issues. And what I will say there is, I was in Israel in November. I was there with the IDF. We did see some very senior political people, but I was mostly there with the Israeli military, very small group of kind of senior Americans. And they took us on. They actually took us into Lebanon. They took us into Gaza. We had extensive conversations about both what they had already accomplished and what they were planning for the future for both Lebanon and for Gaza. And all of the issues that you're getting at, Naomi, were all bound up together. And I will say that I came away, again, just unbelievably impressed with their military capabilities and what they were able to do, but very, very concerned about the long-term political considerations because of the two issues that you're getting at. And let me put them together. What we heard from the Israelis was, look, our first preference in both Gaza and Lebanon is an indigenous solution. So what we hope is that in Lebanon, the new Lebanese government and the Lebanese armed forces will be able to take control over all of Lebanon's territory, disarm Hezbollah, and sign a peace agreement with us. And what we hope in Gaza is that we will get a new Palestinian leadership, probably one based around the Palestinian Authority. This is Mahmoud Abbas's regime that rules in the West Bank, probably based around them, that will come into Gaza and be a new governing authority there that we can work with and again live at peace with them. And so we pushed back on that and said, what do you think the likelihood of that is? And they said, not very likely. And so we said, okay, so what's plan B? And the best way I can describe plan B in both Gaza and Lebanon was what I call the Roman frontiers model. So if you remember your ancient history, right, remember the Roman Empire, right, how they were constantly fighting with German tribes across the Rhine and across the Danube River, right? Constant warfare. The legions were always fighting, right? They'd get attacked. They'd mount punitive expeditions into Germany, right? Just constant warfare. But this constant warfare created peace elsewhere in the empire, right? That's the model that I heard, right? That, we're going to continue to occupy territory in both Gaza and Lebanon. We're not going to give it back to Hezbollah. Anytime we see Hezbollah or Hamas starting to reconstitute military capabilities, we're going to go in there, we're going to crush it as often as we need to do so. And, the group of people I was with and myself, we all said to them, boy, that's going to be really hard to do. They sort of assured us, no, our people are ready for it. After October 7th, we're determined, we're willing to make any sacrifice to keep the peace in Israel proper. And again, I came away thinking that sounded a lot like the United States of America, the American people after 9/11, right? When we were absolutely willing to, it was like John F. Kennedy had been reborn, pay any price, bear any burden. And we were for a while. But over time, it got harder and harder and harder. And I think, as one of my colleagues on this trip pointed out, it's going to be hard to reconcile the startup nation with the Roman frontiers, right? How does that startup nation hold on to that kind of Roman frontiers mentality? How do they continue to have far more men and also women under arms and in combat situations during this period of time? And then the point about Gaza. And, here I will say that I've seen a lot of urban destruction in my life from combat operations. I've even, been in places that were technically still in combat. I was in Fallujah after the Marines went through in 2004. I was in Baghdad at various points during the Iraqi Civil War. I was in Basra right after Operation Charge of the Knights. I was in Mosul during the combat operations. I have seen a lot of urban destruction. I have never in my life seen anything like Rafah in the Gaza Strip. Every single building was destroyed, not damaged, destroyed. I've never seen anything like it in my life. And again, I know exactly what happened on October 7th. I know exactly why Israel is trying to do what they're doing. I have enormous sympathy for them. But I think that it is going to be very, very hard for the nation of Israel, a democratic nation with an extremely well-educated and enlightened population. I think it's going to be very hard for them to maintain this kind of an approach for a long term. The last point I will make on it is it's going to be very hard for Israel to solve this problem itself, right? The United States, our allies, the international community, the other Arab states, we're going to have to be part of the solution because Israel can't solve it itself. Roman frontiers or relying on the Palestinian Authority, those are really the only two models they have available to them. If there's going to be a better outcome for Israel and for the Palestinians and for the Lebanese, the United States is going to have to do a lot more than we've been willing to do so far.
Thank you.
Any other,
I
any
had
other,
a, oh,
any
go
other
ahead.
questions from the panel?
Yes, I had one question just to shift slightly. I know that you had talked and written about the Houthis and the decision to bomb them and to not bomb them. And I wondered if you, any further comments?
Yeah, it's a really good one, Carolyn. I will, again, I think I've told you guys, I've had some interactions with Houthi representatives and I found them absolutely appalling. I'm skeptical that even this level of bombing is going to get them to stop their attacks on shipping altogether. I just think that they get way too much out of it. They might decide to do it temporarily if the pain becomes too much, but I think that they will look for opportunities to restart and try to dare us to keep doing this in the hope that President Trump will get distracted or that other actors will be able to prevent him from doing so. I will also say, I think the Houthis are a long-term problem. I think that the bombing is nothing but, even if it works, it's nothing but a short-term palliative. The Houthis are, they are Iranian backed, but even more than that, they hate America. They hate Israel. They say it every chance they can get. They act on it. They are forces for tremendous instability. They hate our Saudi allies. They hate our Emirati allies. I would like to see them gone. And the truth is that this bombing campaign is not going to do that. From my perspective, this is one, I think I've told this group, where we should go back to the old, we used to get called the Reagan Doctrine, or if you don't like it, you can call it something else, right? It's what we did backing indigenous groups in Chad, in Afghanistan, in Angola, right? We do this all over the world. There is an indigenous opposition to the Houthis. In fact, most of the population of Yemen doesn't like the Houthis, would like them gone. The Houthis represent maybe 12% of the population of Yemen, right? I think that we should be trying to, arm and these are groups that are already fighting against them. That's what we ought to be doing, because I think that's the only long-term solution for the Houthis. And if we don't do that, we're going to have problems with these guys for years to come, whether it's this or something else.
I thought it was fascinating that Trump pointedly blamed the Iranians for supporting and supplying the Houthis, and basically he almost declared war on Iran if you read his comments in a certain way. Comments on that? I mean, typical Trump or
Yeah,
maybe
exactly.
something more serious.
Well, this is always the problem, Tyler, is it's typical Trump, and sometimes it does become more serious, but you can never tell, right? It's very hard to know because he says all kinds of stuff, and he actually seems to act on, I don't know, 10% of it, 5% of it, 1% of it. It's just really hard to know what he's actually going to act on, what he isn't. I did read those as mostly being more negotiation with the Iranians, saying to them, I don't like what you're doing in all of these different places. And if you don't make this deal with me, this better deal, and I think he does hope that it will be a regional deal, not just about the nuclear program, then, there will be unspecified consequences.
Okay, June, I think we got some questions from the audience. Do you want to handle
Sure.
those?
Let me just turn over right now to Amy, if that's all right, and then come back
Sure.
to me on questions.
Okay.
Excuse me, my apologies for being late. June, I think you had a question actually before I did, and I don't know if Ken addressed what you were thinking before.
Well, let me read then the question. One was, what can be expected from Saudi Arabia to influence the near future? And then my question is also one about what's going on with Jordan. There have been, I think, articles about all of the fear that Palestinians and others will come into Jordan as immigrants, and the country is already somewhat unstable. So I think Jordan is also a question as to how do we prop up Jordan so that it stays strong.
Sure, great questions. And let me do them in reverse order. Let me deal with Jordan first, and then we'll talk about Saudi Arabia. And I'm going to try to do these quickly because I know we don't have a whole lot of time, and I at very least want to make sure I get Amy's question in as well. With Jordan, I think you put it nicely, June, which is we all love the government of Jordan. We all hope that Jordan remains stable and strong, but Jordan has been constantly under threat. It is a country with very, very few natural resources, with very little water, with very little arable land, and some very significant issues in terms of its demographics. There's a large Palestinian population, Palestinian origin population, some refugees from 48, some refugees from 67, some from even more recent than that. You've got a ruling family, the Hashemites, who are not themselves Palestinian, although the queen is Palestinian. There's lots of friction. There's lots of unhappiness from the population because of corruption charges against the government. I feel like almost every day I say a little prayer for Jordan because if something happened to it, it would be absolutely disastrous. I will say that I think that the US and Israel and the Europeans have actually been quite good with Jordan over the last 20, 30 years. There's been a lot of aid flowing into Jordan. The Israelis have been terrific about not just aid, but also trade and investment and, really trying to do any number of things to be helpful to the Jordanian economy. It's not that they don't try to make their money, businessmen do what businessmen do, but the government has been very good about trying to create incentives and structures that enable the Israeli economy to buttress the Jordanian economy. That said, I don't think any of us should simply be blasé about the state of Jordan and assume that it's all going to be fine well into the future. As I said, they've got all kinds of different issues. Water is becoming a very big one, although again, there are plans on the books for Israel and Jordan to do joint desalination efforts that could be very, very helpful there. But we've all got to pay a lot of attention to Jordan. The one good news, and it's nice for me to actually say some good news about any country in the Middle East, is that again, many of you will remember, I've been saying for years now that the Iranians were focusing on Jordan. Jordan was their next target. And the defeats that they have suffered over the course of the last 18 months have really alleviated the Iranian pressure on Jordan, at least for now. The Iranians will be back, but at least for now, that Iranian threat to Jordan has abated. That's at least some good news. With regard to the Saudis, and again, this is a very complicated one, but I'm going to try to boil it down in the interest of time. The Saudis are of very mixed feelings about the Trump administration coming to office. And I think that, truth be told, the reporting in the newspapers has actually been very superficial and for that reason, very poor on Saudi Arabia. The Saudis felt badly betrayed by Donald Trump during the first Trump administration. They promised all kinds of things, but ultimately, and it's always important, critically important to understand that for the Saudis, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States is that the Saudis keep the price of oil at a reasonable level and a steady, stable oil market. And in return, we defend them. And you all may remember that in 2019, the Iranians started attacking Saudi oil exports, and the US did nothing. In fact, President Trump went out there and said, the Iranians can do whatever they want as long as they don't kill Americans. I don't care. And that was absolutely terrifying to the Saudis. I mean, I can't convey how shocking and frightening that was to them, because this is basically the basis of their security being thrown out the window, right? It would be like, imagine, all of the police in Chappaqua suddenly just leaving, right? Moving away and saying, we don't care about you people. We're not going to do anything to protect you anymore. Or, worse, Chappaqua is pretty nice. Imagine if you lived in the South Bronx and that happened, right? So this was really frightening. They don't like that. In addition, what President Trump has been doing since he came back into office really hasn't worked for the Saudis, right? So he's demanding that the Saudis pump more oil to lower the price, while simultaneously trying to get the US to pump more oil, which will lower the price even further. And by the way, oil prices right now are actually quite low, right? Last time I looked, Brent was at about $67 a barrel. Just so you understand, the Saudis need oil to be at $93 a barrel for them to balance their budget. Okay, so just to pay for all their expenses, they need oil at $93 a barrel. They're willing to run a deficit. They'd like to have oil in the $80 a barrel range, so it works for both us and for them. But $67 and falling is disastrous for the Saudis. In addition, it's unclear if we're actually going to enforce the oil sanctions on Russia, right? They're afraid that Trump is going to cut a deal with Putin. That'll be gone. That's more Russian oil on the market. Price drops further. We, are talking about a deal with Iran. If there's a deal with Iran, more Iranian oil, price drops further, right? This is all disastrous for Saudi Arabia. And President Trump doesn't seem to be interested in doing any of the things that they want, like getting a Palestinian-Israeli deal, right? They've made very clear they need to see a peace process going. They don't need to see a Palestinian state, but they need to see a real peace process going, right? For their own internal reasons, which are very, very real. In addition, they want us protecting them against the Iranians, and they don't know what Trump's new deal with the Iranians is going to look like. They're hoping it's better than what Obama got. They're afraid it's worse. So the truth of the matter is, the Saudis are very, very uncertain about Trump. He says nice things, right? They think that they know how to deal with him, but they're very unhappy with a lot of the things that they're seeing and hearing from President Trump. And if this is the direction that Trump continues to go in with them, expect them to take a more and more independent line. And by the way, I tried very hard to end on a positive note with Jordan. I got to end on a somewhat negative note with Saudi Arabia, which is, the biggest thing that any of us had going for us with the Saudis is they were so frightened of Iran. That was driving them toward us. That was driving them toward Israel. The truth of the matter is the way that Israel has beaten Iran over the last 18 months, the Saudis aren't as afraid of Iran as they once were. And so they don't feel the same need for deal with Israel, deal with us that they once did. So as I said, I think Saudi Arabia is going to be a very complicated one. And I've not yet seen a sense from President Trump that he understands where the Saudis are and that he can't be pushing them on every front simultaneously.
Yeah, you just actually answered most of what I was going to ask, but maybe the last piece, or maybe you can just kind of add one or two thoughts. How much are the linkages that you just articulated brought up, particularly in the negotiations between Israel and Gaza, that, right, all of these threads come together, and it has seemed over the last several months that the Gulf states are really the ones trying to drive, or at least keep a momentum going for the talks between Israel and Gaza. And I wonder how much of these other tentacles, right, the Iran piece, the oil piece, the Russia piece, are discussed around the table. Do you have any kind of whispers from that?
Uh, Amy, this is such a great question, and I wish I had a better sense. And I'll put it this way, the folks who I talk to in the Trump administration are really smart people who understand the Middle East, but they're also fairly junior, right? The folks at the top aren't necessarily Middle East hands, and it's just not clear how much traction that they're actually getting, that is the experts with those folks at the top. I think Marco Rubio is a very serious guy. You can agree or disagree with his policies, but I think he's a serious guy. I think that he, takes being Secretary of State seriously. I think Mike Waltz is a serious guy, the new Secretary of State. New National Security Advisor. Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, I'll simply say that I think that the jury is out at best on him. But other than a tour in Iraq, he doesn't necessarily seem to have a great deal of expertise when it comes to the Middle East. Steve Witkoff, I think, has proven himself to be a pretty skillful negotiator. But again, this is not someone with a background in international relations, let alone the Middle East. And, the president is not someone who is, I'm trying to be very kind here, not someone who is at all well versed in international relations or the realities of the Middle East. And, what we saw from him both during the first term and since he's come back into office is, he makes a lot of grandiose statements. And it's never clear whether he understands exactly what he's proposing, or B, why he's doing so. Right. I mean, one of the great parlor games of Washington, not that we don't want for parlor games, right? But one of the great ones over the last couple of months is the, Gaza a Largo debate. Did he actually mean that? Or was that simply, a stalking horse, a way to kind of break open the ice and get people to think in different ways? How much of this was because Jared was looking at the beachfront property in the first term and said, "Boy, I'd love to build casinos here." This is all out there, and none of us knows. And I'm perfectly willing to believe that some version of all of it may be happening at different points in time, in Trump's head or in some of these different meetings. But I will end, Amy, by saying that this is part of the problem that the administration creates for itself, right? I mean, and I think the president too, likes to think that, he's an out of the box thinker, and, he sees possibilities that other people can't, and he's a disruptor. And the problem is that this isn't Silicon Valley, and this isn't a tech business, right? This is the United States of America and the Middle East. And it neither operates on the same principles as Tesla or Google or a family or a real estate deal or any of these other analogies that these folks use. as I was saying before, when I was talking about Ahmed Ashara's situation in Syria, these people all have very real political considerations, military considerations, and let's be honest, physical considerations. Ahmed Ashara has to fear for his life. Mahmoud Abbas fears for his life. Right? At some level, Bibi may also fear for his life. There are a lot of people whose lives are on the line, whose livelihoods are on the line, whose families' futures are on the line. That just isn't the case when you're talking about a real estate deal or reorganizing Tesla. Right? And so, how much these people actually understand the realities and can see the constituencies and the complex political circumstances when there is no profit motive, when there is no ability to simply walk away if you just don't get the right deal and I'll go find a different apartment house to buy. Right? No one knows the answer to that. Again, a lot of the problems that were created in the first term seem to have been a product of that lack of familiarity. And again, I'm being very, very euphemistic here, but of that lack of familiarity with the realities of the Middle East and of international relations. So I can look at the Gaza proposals and say, all right, we got people thinking differently, but that lasted about a week. And we're now back where we are because the realities are what they are.
Wow, June,
I
I
think
think we've
we
got it.
are,
Yeah,
I think we need to wrap up. So, Ken, I'm gonna tell you, we could go on and we are fascinated, we are terrified, all various mixed emotions, but we
My world.
have learned a great deal from you. So,
You pick quite a world, Ken.
and I don't know, we certainly need to have you back again. At this rate, it might be 6 months, but in any case, I don't know if we can wait for a year. But thank you very much, and we really do appreciate your being with us and that real wonderful feeling that we have for you and you have for our organization. So thank you, and we look forward to your visit to Chappaqua. We're holding you to that, by the way.
I look forward to it. And thank you all. It is always such a pleasure.
Ken, thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Absolutely
again.
terrific.
Good
Yeah.
All right.
Before
See you
we
again.
sign off, let me,
Okay.
I want to remind you that we do have our next meeting on April 1st. So it's going to be a little different. As you can see, this is a very demanding time for our speakers. And so it's been very hard for us to always keep with a Monday at 10 a.m. schedule as much as we try. So our next speaker will be on Tuesday, April 1st at 10 a.m. We are being joined by Zen Han, who is the assistant professor at political science and global affairs at Sacred Heart University, and he's going to be speaking about BRICS. So BRICS, I think the question has always been, is BRICS just against the United States and that's the thing that's holding them together? Or is this something far more formidable and much more of an organization that is developing alliances among themselves? So please join us, mark your calendar, Tuesday, April 1. It will not be April Fools. This will be serious. And we hope to see you then. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. See you again. Bye-bye.
Bye.